This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you for showing interest in our second Let's Talk Transport Fireside Chat. My name is Christopher Decky. I'm from the SLOCAT Partnership Secretariat, and I'm really happy to have you all here to join us in this new activity that we've been launching as part of our new slew of activities and tools in our Tough Questions, Smart Answers series. So we're making a lot of moves today by having this second Fireside Chat and by also launching a new blog series around the Tough Questions, Smart Answers themes. So we're really working in SLOCAT to try to have new ways of approaching key issues in sustainable low carbon transport. And this Fireside Chat and that blog series I just mentioned are just a small part of it. So we hope that you will all continue to participate and join us in future iterations of our Fireside Chat, have a look at our blogs, and join us for future virtual webinars and activities. So we're really excited to have you all here to talk about an important topic about the nexus between transport and happiness, how mobility and transport can kind of further quality of life. We always talk about how transport emissions and pollution that it creates or possibly can create kind of detracts from our quality of life. We want to turn that on its head and focus on the opposite and see how transport and mobility issues can really foster a good quality of life, can lead to health and happiness. And so we brought together a nice group of speakers who are going to take us on this little adventure through this concept of transport and quality of life, of mobility and happiness, and they're going to guide us through this conversation. So just a few housekeeping rules before I pass it on to our moderator. A few things, please, when you join our call, make sure you mute yourselves so that we can maintain the quality of the speakers and everybody can hear them. Also, don't put on your video so we can also maintain the quality of the bandwidth of the wider conversation. And then please direct all your questions to the chat box because I'm going to be working with my SLOCAT colleagues to kind of funnel those questions toward our moderator so that later on in the event, we can try to get your questions answered. Okay, so I'd like to now pass on the floor to Bronwen Thornton. She is the CEO of Walk 21 and the chair of the board of directors of SLOCAT. So we're super happy to have her here moderating our Fireside Chat. And I pass the floor on to you now, Bronwen. Thank you so much.
Great, thanks so much, Chris. I'm very pleased to be here today for the second Fireside Chat and on the day that we've launched the first blog of our morning commute. And not just because I wrote that blog, but because I was asked to write that blog, and it's about walking, which of course is very dear to my heart and my entire professional life, about embedding and supporting walking in our communities. And we've been talking about health and happiness and walking for a very long time, and I think reaching from my starting place out through the community of sustainable transport to having this conversation is very exciting. It's great to be sharing the panel with three very insightful minds on this subject. Firstly, Kristie Daniel, who works with Healthbridge from Canada. She works out of Canada, but she works with local partners in Asia and Africa. Working also with Glynda Bathan from Clean Air Asia, based in Manila, and the work they've done around transport and particularly around monitoring air quality. And last but no ways least, Siri from the Wellcome Trust, who's working at the intersection, and no small intersection is this either, around human activity, environmental change, and health. So I think with those three starting points, we're going to have a really fantastic discussion today. So I know that we are in different parts of the planet. It's good afternoon here and the thunder has started, so it's going to be a hot and tumultuous afternoon. Good morning to all of those to my west, and good evening to all of those to my east. I hope you've all got your various cups of tea, coffee and wine to join us in this conversation, because it is a fireside chat. We're hoping to have an informal discussion and include your inputs to that today. And the reason that I find this topic so interesting is because as much as happiness might be central to our lives, It hasn't really been at the heart of the transport agenda before. Transport engineers love economics and efficiencies and capacities and journey times. They're not, our KPIs for the transport sector has historically not been around these things. The relationship between health and our transport systems is well documented, the links with road safety, physical activity, and the overt benefits of being physical activity for our mental health, which supports our happiness. But these relationships are not part of that measuring framework that I talked about. And so I'm really interested to see how we can take this discussion and reach into some of those topics. And to set a loose framework for that, I want to start with the notion of sustainable happiness. And this was introduced to me by Dr. Catherine O'Brien. In 2007, we hosted our conference in Toronto in Canada, and she had done some work around sustainable happiness. And I think it really frames up how we can be leading our discussion today. And her definition was sustainable happiness is happiness that contributes to individual, community, and/or global well-being without exploiting other people, the environment, or future generations. Now, if that's not a catch-all for this conversation, it's about us as individuals, it's about our community, it's about our planet, and it's about happiness without exploitation. So our happiness is not at the cost of someone else's. And we'll come to that in the discussions when we look at the impacts and the relationships between the global north and the global south. And aspects around equity and the broader ambitions of the Sustainable Development Goals. So health and happiness are not just about physical activity. It'd be very easy to just talk about walking and have a whole conversation about how fantastic that is for our health and our happiness. But when you ask people about transport and happiness, they interact in many and complex and at times quite competing ways. For example, I sat in a meeting once and I was saying we have to provide for walking. It makes people happy and healthy. And a freight manager said to me, but people want fresh fish on a Friday, and that's what makes them happy. But those delivery trucks to bring that fresh fish, try saying that too quickly, to market in some communities can also mean that we bring danger and pollution from those heavy vehicles onto our streets. An open road can bring happiness to a car driver. Getting somewhere quickly can bring that same driver happiness as well. But what costs the congestion and pollution that comes from those journeys and the impact of that on others? So I think we've got some lovely challenges around this complexity and how we might tease those out today and look at quality of life for ourselves and our communities. So let's start with the very essence of this discussion. And I'm going to pass to Kristie in the first instance. And that lovely question, what is happiness? And is it transport's job to contribute to making us happy? Thanks, Kristie.
So thanks. That is most definitely a tough question. And I will admit that I pondered it for the entire weekend. And my initial reaction when I read the question was, oh, that's so American. So the Americans have in their Constitution, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In the Canadian Constitution, the comparable is peace, order, and good government. And so I tend to look at things in a more utilitarian way a lot of the time. And so it was nice to sort of break out of that. And think about that. So in terms of what is happiness, I think there's often a confusion between happiness and pleasure. And so pleasure is that immediate feeling that you have. Let's say you buy a really great dessert and the pleasure that you have of feeling it in your mouth versus the happiness that you get from eating a healthy diet over the long term. And so by having a healthy body, by feeling well. And so I think a lot of time people confuse pleasure and happiness. And so for me, there's definitely a distinction. I thought, okay, I'm going to be a little bit researchy and I'm going to look up, how do people define happiness? And some things that really resonated with me in terms of that definition were words like contentedness. So I don't often think when people think of happiness, they think of, I'm excited all the time, but really if you are contented over the long term, you're you're feeling quite happy. Well-being, obviously, I'm a health person, public health person, so having people, their bodies feel healthy all the time, that leads to happiness. But I also thought that things like gratitude, meaningfulness, having a life that feels worthwhile, all of these things contribute to happiness. So, okay, so then what is transportation's job related to happiness? Well, I tend to look at it more from the collective versus the individual. And so, because I often do what I call a Carol test. And so Carol is my mother, and my mother is a typical baby boomer who is 70 years old, has zero interest in walking anywhere, has zero interest in biking anywhere. She loves her big car, wants to go to Paris until I told her that she's going to have to walk everywhere, and now she doesn't want to go to Paris anymore. So I do the Carol test. If we make Carol happy, that will be bad for the collective, right? And so I think that transportation's job is to manage our resources well. So our resources in terms of land, our resources in terms of air. If we consider the health of the population as a collective resource, it is transportation's job to manage that. It's not transportation's job to make my mom happy. So the Carol happiness is not important in relation into that. And so the other piece to it that I think is important is that transportation takes you to the destinations that also lead to happiness. And one of the things that I think the pandemic has brought up for a lot of people is it's not the things that make us happy. You know, it's not buying the whatever, it's the getting hugs from our family. So for those of us that haven't been able to see our families for 6 months or however long it's been, you know, the first time I see my mom, car lover that she is, I'm going to be really happy to give her a hug. And so it's going to be getting to that destination. If you find your work meaningful, then transportation's job is to get you to that meaningful job. That's not to say that the journey itself can't also provide pleasure, it can't also be important, but it is transport's job to not make you miserable getting to the destination that you want, right? So I think about all the times I traveled on the subway in Toronto. I wasn't feeling happy when I was on the, but as long as it was getting me to where I wanted to go, it wasn't making me unhappy either. And so those were some of the things I was thinking about this weekend as I was laying the patio stones, thinking about happiness and transportation. So why don't I pass it on to Jose to get his take on happiness.
Can you hear me now? Yes, thanks. Really interesting answer and a really interesting question, I thought, and sort of a very philosophical question. And I also thought about it a lot. For me, and I think my answer is going to be a little bit controversial. For me, happiness is really a feeling of contentment or fulfillment or enjoyment of the world. And that's true both, as Kristie says, at the level of sensation, you know, quality of things that are coming in and you enjoy them, but also at a deeper level. But one of the issues about happiness is that it sort of has no preconditions. So I've certainly known people who are extremely poor, or people who are sick, or people who are living under conditions of significant insecurity who are happy. And at the same time, I've known people who are healthy and wealthy and secure who are significantly unhappy. Happiness is individual. What makes me happy may not make you happy. Some people love to be on a bike. For other people, it's a real drag. In the context of COVID, some people are actually happy to be able to putter around their homes, whereas for other people, it's a real tragedy. And so, in a sense, happiness is very hard to pin down. Of course, I think Bronwen mentioned at the beginning, you can be happy at someone else's expense. There are conflicting happinesses. So is it transport's job to make us happy? I actually don't think so. I think that that's too much of a burden to place on any human system. But we can talk about well-being, and I'm glad that both Bronwen and Kristie brought that up. Well-being is something that does have preconditions. So to be well, you have to have health. You have to have access to health care. You have to have access to a decent living and livelihood. You have to have access to security and equity and justice and beauty and nature and a whole range of other things. That's what it means to be well. So absolutely, transport has an obligation to deliver well-being. And I think that, in fact, every human system has an obligation to put well-being at the core of its values and of its goals. And in the context of transport, that brings up a number of questions that are obvious questions. So can you get to where you need to go to access the components of well-being easily? Are there options for getting there that you can take if there are different barriers? Are those options pleasant? Is it crowded? Is it noisy? Is it uplifting? Are you exposed to health risks in your transport or in the things that you have to do? Very importantly, and this was already talked about, what are the downstream unintended consequences of the decisions we make around transportation? And so I think that this concept of well-being as a concept is a lot more stable, it's more universal, it's more controllable, we have more that we can do to influence it, and it's more measurable, and that makes it, in a sense, a more useful concept for thinking about how our systems can promote our well-being. I have to come back to that word. So thanks. I'll pass it to Glynda.
Hi everyone. I'll just keep my video off to keep bandwidth. Yes, I did. It is quite an interesting question, and it did require that I stop and think about such an important question. And so I was, while thinking about it, I somehow wanted to compare it to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where the most basic requirement is all of the things that you need to survive. So that definitely is needed. So food, shelter, health. But then as you go up the pyramid, there is self-actualization. And while it's difficult to explain what that is, I probably means, really having the time to be with your loved ones and the time to appreciate beauty. And in practical terms, when I was reflecting on what that really means to people and to me, in situations in the developing city or developing country context, I think happiness and the relationship to transport is many times equated with the time that is required in one's daily commute. So as you know, many of us are in work from home situations because of the quarantines and the lockdowns, and there is this question on whether we should ask our staff to come back to work. And after discussing with several staff, I think um, the difficulty is really the time that the daily commute takes from the time that they could have been spending with loved ones and doing all other things that could make them happy. So I guess that's my take on this first question, Bronwen.
I think, Glynda, that's a really lovely point to move on from, because during COVID-19, during this global pandemic, which has had significant health issues and transport impacts, has there been, do you think, some happiness return in terms of people being at home, not losing that time to the commutes? I take nothing away from the health crisis or the economic impacts of this, but are people seeing a value in their time and a different perception of how they could move or be in our cities as a result of COVID-19? And just to sort of take that thread a little bit further, does that give us opportunities then for looking forwards and how we might leverage from this time into a more sustainable and potentially happier, with greater well-being future for our communities? Would you like to pick up on that thread, please, Glynda?
Yes, thank you, Bronwen. Indeed, there have been great benefits, at least for many of our staff and several of my friends who are working from home, that spending time with family and having to skip, the sometimes 2 hours to an extreme one-way commute, in Metro Manila, because it has really become congested, is something that they do not miss: the daily commute, getting into the city and getting out of the city. And while, of course, as we know, working from home also does affect the work-life balance, because you now do not know exactly when work ends and when life begins in a work from home context. It is offset by the fact that they gain more time, they are more productive, and many of the things that they thought they needed to do, or many of the services, for example, that they needed without, when the lockdown wasn't in place, they've all shifted. Many have shifted to actually doing things digitally. So there's an increase in digitalization, and therefore avoiding a motorized trip, and therefore reducing the impact of transportation to the environment, especially if it's using a fossil fuel run vehicle. But then we have to also take a look at there is more delivery service that is being required, because instead of going to the grocery, then you try to get everything delivered to your home. So that also needs to, the impact of the increased transportation and freight travel within the city during the lockdown is something to also take account of.
And do you see, Glynda, that you've been monitoring air quality? It's been fairly well sort of discussed that we've enjoyed bluer skies and cleaner air. Do you see that the potential for managing the commute and more working from home, that this digital approach to life, even if not every day, but on a mixture of options, might be part of future transport planning to help reduce those air pollution impacts and that congestion? Do you see it as a viable
Yes.
option?
Yes, we are actually seeing that during the very strict quarantine situation in Metro Manila, for example. There were reports by universities and from our monitoring as well that there was a significant decrease in particulate matter, fine particulate matter, so PM 2.5, in cities in Metro Manila, particularly along the main thoroughfare, which is EDSA, and so people, there is a desire now from many urban residents to keep that benefit that the lockdown had provided. And we are lucky that somehow the government has responded by putting in place bikeways along the main thoroughfare, protected bikeways, and having a segregated bus lane, effectively reducing the space that is being used by private vehicles. So there is the potential to actually, now is the right time to push for these types of measures, because as we saw, there was tremendous political will in even having lockdowns in place. We would never have thought that that would even be possible, but now that there is that political will, and there is heightened awareness of the gains of reducing polluting vehicles on the road, we who are for active transportation should really be pushing and helping government towards this direction.
Great, thank you so much. I think I know that EDSA, and I think it would be a lovely elevated long park through the city of Manila one day if we could remove all the vehicles and do what they did in Seoul with their elevated highway. I'd like to come back to Kristie, because you work in South Asia, and what are you finding? What are you seeing happening in the communities and with your local partners around these elements of quality of life and the impact of COVID and the perception that the potential for us to build back better, as some are saying, but to embed some of these new relationships with our transport systems in the future?
So if I may, I'd like to touch a little bit on the on the digital and express a little bit of my concern about this idea that we have the potential to shift a lot of transportation into digital. And the reason why a lot of that concerns me is that you end up losing a lot of social cohesion in a community when you shift the purchase of goods, for example, from a face-to-face interaction that you might be having in Dhaka with your local vendor, and you shift that to a more digital platform. And what I've been seeing from the Healthbridge partners is that COVID has resulted in fairly significant mental health issues for many people. The social isolation, especially when you come from a culture where you are not used to being home alone, and even, you know, you're with your family, but you're used to having a much larger net of people with whom you interact with every day, that it's causing a lot of concern and a lot of anxiety. And so the idea that if we could shift some of that to more digital platform, although that might help from a transportation perspective and an air quality perspective, I think it actually has the potential to impact and have a mental health impact, which is quite concerning. So for me, I think, and you know, from a resiliency perspective, if we want to have resilient cities, we need to have cities where people know each other, where neighbors have the opportunity to interact, usually at street level. So whether that's on the footpath or the sidewalk, or whether it's in a local public market, or whether it's in their local park, having those opportunities for people to interact is really important to create that social cohesion. So I think, sort of touching on what Glynda had talked about, you know, there has been lots of movement in many of the cities where they are trying different things to give people more space, because, you know, with COVID, we're trying to stay 2 meters apart. It's virtually impossible in most cities, including my city of Toronto, for pedestrians to maintain a 2 meter apart distance from each other. Like, there just isn't that space. And so we are seeing governments taking over the road space, so taking away space for cars, but giving it to people. So I've heard lots of people say, well, they're closing the roads. They're not closing the roads, they're opening the roads. They're opening the roads to people. And so we're seeing lots of examples of that. We are seeing also examples where public transportation systems have been shut down, which, you know, causes a problem if we think about the potential for people to then move to cars. But we're also seeing a lot of promotion of bicycles, more promotion of walking, which I think are all really positive. That's not possible, though, if your destination is really far away. And so one of the other things that I think is really important and that cities are starting to explore is, how can we bring destinations closer to people? So if you in your city so one of the essential services is obviously access to food. Everybody needs to have access to food. So in many countries, the local public market then is that essential service. So what is it that cities can do to bring the destinations closer to people so that they're able to stay within their neighborhood and walk? Because that's so much of, so, you know, we hear stories about people having to move from their jobs to 2 hours in one direction. Well, that's because there's no housing close to where that's appropriate, that's close to their job. And that's the case in so many cities, where you have all of the jobs concentrated perhaps in a downtown area, but none of the affordable housing is located in that area. So the affordable housing is located on the periphery. And so it's really starting to think about, how can we design our cities so that those destinations that people want to go to are within walking distance. It's the same with public spaces. We know across the board in all of the cities that Healthbridge and our partners work in, there are not enough public spaces for people to get the recreational and socialization that they need. They're just not enough. And so taking away the road space from cars and opening it up to people has been an opportunity to give that space. And so there's been lots of sort of interesting things that we're starting to see related to that, which I think has been really helpful. And so I'll pass it to Jose.
Thank you. I want to be careful in framing this, because obviously COVID-19 is an immense and really still just beginning to unfold tragedy in terms of its impacts directly on health, but on livelihoods, on societies, on so on and so forth. And I think that we haven't even begun to really understand the ramifications of everything that's happening. It's even more tragic because it was predictable and preventable. But at the same time, there are silver linings, and there are certainly positive things that are coming out. And one of the things that I think is most important is that out of the COVID-19 crisis is coming a huge period of natural experimentation. So we're seeing experimentation across different sectors and different domains of life that we never would have expected to see at this scale or with this speed. So social experimentation, economic experimentation, labor, transport, health. Both at small scales, so within communities, at city scales, and at larger scales. And the outcomes of all these experiments are very much uncertain. What works will depend on the cultural particularities of place, on context in general. We need place-based thinking. In our work, we have a number of projects that are considering impacts of COVID-19 on different systems, and so that we hope that we'll have a lot to say as we get a better understanding of things. So there's a huge need to document these experiments, to understand what's going on, and to see what the processes were that led to decision making, and where they were positive or negative. I think there are a few really clear trends. I wanted to touch on a few of them that, to some extent, they've been mentioned already. One is the shift away from public transport that we're seeing around the world. Which is perfectly justifiable, but we have to make sure that shift is toward active transport where possible, not towards automobiles. In many places it is. We have examples of cities widening bike lanes, setting aside road space for cycling, and that's not just in the global north, it's in cities like Bogota, even Kampala. And more than just seeing that happen now, we have to act to make sure that shift is made permanent insofar as is possible. New ways of working. Kristie talked about this a little bit, digitalization and telework. We're seeing all sorts of different arrangements for these kinds of things. And it's true that there's the potential for that to cause disruptions to social functioning, to mental health, so on and so forth. But there are also potential positives, and there may be ways that we can leverage those different work modalities into better lives. Can we think about ways that the people working from home could gather within their neighborhoods and build social capital and work together? We're going to see experiments in staggered hours probably of work over the next few months as societies reopen and as things start to happen. What are the impacts of those? They will change mobility, they'll change implications for well-being and equity. There may be differential impacts on caregivers for children or the elderly, for example. Often that tends to be women in many cultures. I think maybe the biggest shift that's being accelerated by COVID-19 is just the main attitude to the call to build back better. And we've seen a groundswell of support for that really across an amazing number of sectors. So a few weeks ago, there was a letter from health professionals to the leaders of the G20. And I think 4,500 individual health professionals signed, and organizations representing 40 million health professionals calling for recovery to be green. There's similar efforts from business coalitions, from other sectors. So really everybody has come on board to this, and we have to take advantage of that momentum. We need to use it to reshape recovery. We need to use it to reshape cities. And that means putting pressure on government and working in an integrated way. And I think that Kristie talked about that in the small scale context of cities. Where we really, transport can do a lot to ease well-being impacts, to help address equity impacts, but it can't do it alone. It has to be in the context of working with business community, with urban planning, with energy planning, and with other sectors, with health professionals and other sectors. So, out of this terrible situation that we're in, I very much believe and hope that we can find good things. So.
Jose, can I pick up with that then? Because I think one of the challenges, there were many challenges before the pandemic, and And those challenges are still there, and will be there after the pandemic. I mean, the climate one is the biggest one. But the other challenges around air pollution and quality of life and equity and the impact of the global north on the global south, both in terms of all those externalities of transport systems and the dumping of poor quality vehicles, the urban design systems that have built cities that are unsustainable for the styles of population and movement that is needed in the global south. So, you know, and now the development in that world, the increasing pollution, emissions, the impact of congestion and road safety, road danger. I mean, yes, this moment in time has brought all of those things into sharp focus, and the intersections of road safety, urban child health, gender, air quality, climate. I'm putting it all on your table here, I realize that, but I'm particularly interested in, as we look at it, how do we, in this relationship between the global north and the global south, addressing some of those equity differences, how do we value health and happiness within, you know, the ambitions to build back better, to address these negative externalities, and ensure that the people realize some of those quality of life aspects that we enjoy in the more developed north. I know that's massive. So choose one or two.
Yeah, there's a lot of different questions in there. I think it's unmistakable that COVID has opened sort of an immense policy window that was sort of unimaginable. I mean, if you'd asked a year ago, many climate people would have said they didn't know what it would take sort of to open the window to major climate action, and maybe that's possible now. Although we still have, there's a lot of work to be done. Yeah, so there's questions about, how we avoid replicating the disbenefits and the negative systems that we've seen in the global north that have since to some degree been remediated, and there's a lot of learning that we could apply to the global south. And then there's the question of the connected and interconnected systems between the global north and global south, because they're not operating in a vacuum. Of course, a lot of the problems that are faced by the global south are caused by the global north. I think there's sort of three fundamental processes or phenomena or things that we need to be doing to speak to equity and to speak to those interconnected systems. One is documentation. So to a large degree, I mean, we're talking about massive social and environmental and ecological and physical systems that are interconnected at planetary scales and that interconnect with complex systems at smaller scales. And there's just a lot that we still don't understand about how those systems work. So documentation of impacts, measurement or characterization of systems, and a more systemic approach to these problems is one thing that needs to be happening. Participation is another thing. So we need to make people aware of their impacts in the global north, especially to make them aware that the things that they do in their spaces have implications for people across the world. We need to engage key stakeholders in solutions, and that includes the business community, the public. We need to change the paradigm. And to some extent, you already started to see things happening like that over the last year through people like Greta Thunberg and others. But that whole process needs to accelerate and take advantage of this policy window that we have right now. And the last one, and I've mentioned it before, is integration. And that's both integration at the city scale. So we need to figure out how to do things, or we need mechanisms and modes of governance that help us integrate different sectors and different scales with communities and so on and so forth, but also integration at the global level. There's no country that will be able to deal with these kinds of issues alone. We're all in it together, and we need to take advantage of the global frameworks that connect us. And that, of course, is things like the Sustainable Development Goals, the New Urban Agenda, the Paris Agreement on Climate, the Sendai Agreement on Disaster Risk Reduction. So we need every country to sign on to that. We need every public citizen to support and push their governments to sign on to those. And we need to share expertise and figure out how to do these things. It's not easy to do things in an integrated way. So we are seeing action on all these fronts. I think there's more science on the impacts. There's a move towards things like net zero cities and circular economies. And certainly there's lots of developments in the transport space that are of interest as well. We can talk about supply chains, international air travel, so on and so forth. But I think I will pass it on there to Glynda to say a few words.
Hi, yes, your response, Jose, triggered a lot of thoughts. And one is in terms of the policy window, indeed, there are many opportunities for externalities from transportation to be integrated into policy. And for example, of course, there are issues, as we move our developing countries towards more electric mobility. There's that issue of how is our electricity in this region being generated, because much of Southeast Asia, for example, it's been called the last frontier for coal, because a lot of our power development plans still see an increase in the use of coal. And so how does this region protect itself from the external impacts of electric mobility, with coal as being the source of electricity generation? Then we need to tighten our emission standards for stationary sources, including for electricity generation, so that the air pollution coming from the coal-fired power plants don't reach our cities and don't harm our health. But then also it's moving our entire energy mix with more renewables so that we have cleaner sources of power. And there's always taxes for dirty fuels, for example, which the Philippines has just done recently in its tax reform law. And increasing taxation for vehicles that are run on conventional fuels, so diesel and gasoline, while removing import taxes from electric mobility solutions. One thing, though, when you mentioned participation, Jose, you see there is a tendency for governments, and I've seen some examples where I live, where because we are in an emergency situation, that there seems to be an acceptance that participation in decision making can be shortcut, and the undesirable polluting, for example, jeepneys. I don't know if you're familiar with this vehicle in the Philippines, which runs on 20-year-old second-hand diesel engines, but does provide people with access to transportation. But there have been moves from government to modernize these jeepneys, but there has been resistance from this sector, because the assistance is the subsidies that are provided are limited. There's no clear plan for shifting livelihoods, and there's some indication that because of this acceptance that draconian measures are acceptable during an emergency situation, that they can be excluded as because they don't run on clean fuels, clean engines, that they aren't given routes for the public, because we're now cutting down on the supply of public transport is reduced, because only 50% of the workforce will be going back to offices. So we have to be careful. We have to also be very vigilant about ensuring that stakeholders like the jeepney drivers who rely on this for their livelihoods, that their voices are heard, and that they're not forgotten, that their needs aren't forgotten.
So
Yeah.
could I pick up on that? Just a couple of points. So one thing that Jose mentioned that I think is important, or it triggered something in me, is that for all of the calls of Build Back Better, so for all of us that are calling for that, I don't think we should ever forget that there is a lot of money to be made in keeping things the status quo. And so the very global and public calls to do things better, I think, are also being counteracted very quietly by lobbyists to keep things the way they were. And so I think that's something that we should always keep in the back of our minds. And then in terms of something that Glynda just said, there was a saying that I saw probably on Facebook that's really stuck with me. And so people were always saying, oh, we're all in the same boat. And this person said, we're not in the same boat. We're all in the same storm. We're each in different boats. And so this idea, so all of the draconian measures that governments are implementing, those are typically being implemented on the people who are the most vulnerable. Right, so it's going to be the rickshaw drivers in Bangladesh, or it's going to be the informal vendors. There's been lots of instances across the world of governments really taking this opportunity to crack down on the informal vendors because they see that as a way of dealing with a problem that they have always had, and this is now their opportunity to deal with it. Well, at the same time, not acknowledging that in many cases, the informal sector is 60% of the economy, and you have no social safety net. So what are you going to? So we're not all in this. We're in the same storm, but we're not in the same boat. And that, I think, then really lends itself to the equity question, which is really, I see it as government's job. So going back to the very original question, is it transport's job to deliver happiness? I actually am on the side of Jose, where I don't actually think that's the case. It's government's job to deliver a transportation system that doesn't make people unhappy, but that creates an equitable playing field across the board. And so we don't need to be investing in systems and structures for the people in society who already have a lot of resources at their disposal. We really want to be creating systems for those people who need government support to help them achieve the well-being and achieve everything that they have the potential to do and have that meaningful life that leads to happiness. So I think, so to me, that was sort of a couple of things that struck me from what my colleagues said. So I'll pass it to you, Bronwen, because I think you wanted to ask another question. So.
No, I really like that. I love that analogy of the storm and the boats. I remember when I first heard that, it just resonates so completely about what version of In It Together we are all living through. I think that's fantastic. So I wanted to pick up on this idea as we sort of go around this topic. So we're coming to a feeling that we're not responsible for happiness in the transport sector, but there are responsibilities to equity and well-being that governments can step up for and use transport to address and ensure transport doesn't exacerbate or make worse. So I'm making a note that potentially a future KPI for a transport system is equity, and that reflects back on a lot of the discussions that are happening. When I first moved into this world, which is getting longer and longer ago, you know, we talked about transport. I came from a transport background and discovered that we were talking about mobility, and now people are talking about accessibility, about proximity of services, proximity of opportunities, and the accessibility of those opportunities. And I think this is where some of these measures around equity, around well-being, come into play, because it's never straightforward, but it gives us a way of measuring, coming back to Jose's point about what's measurable and what can we sort of hold people to account for, or measure impact and therefore success, which is always so important, particularly to politicians, to look like you're achieving something. And so I'd like to use that to go back to you, Jose, around how do we build some of these ideas into measurable impacts of our transport systems and address this equity issue, because Kristie is absolutely right. The car industry is not going to go quietly. The fossil fuel industry is definitely not going quietly. They're working hard to sustain their place in the system. And how do we rebalance those dimensions around this equity issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think again there are multiple questions in there, and certainly I agree that the systems that are resisting change are tremendously powerful. And so we have to reckon with that. And the other thing is it's possible even when we're trying to do things that are pro-change, pro-positive change, that we can have negative unintended consequences. And you can think about, for example, the Gilets jaunes in France, which the original uprising of that movement came about as the result of a fuel tax, which was intended to reduce carbon emissions. So I think the first thing, again, I'm going to come back to these three things. One is documentation. We need to understand the impacts before we can advocate for any sort of action. And that's not just understanding sort of linear impacts between an individual action and the thing that we expect to happen from it. It's understanding the whole system. Understanding like that helps you anticipate problems like the Gilets jaunes movement. Once we're armed with that kind of information, once we know what the impacts are likely to be, then we're in a much better position to build advocacy for things that can resist the lobbying, that can counteract the strong systems that are in place to oppose those kinds of things. And that requires participation again. Participation takes lots of different forms. One of the things that we try and do in our work is promote transdisciplinary research. So that's research that incorporates communities and people directly in the research process, so that it's really taking into account feasibility, it's taking into account the lived experience of people who will use systems. Participation also includes things like participatory budgeting, giving people a say in how money is spent in communities, public consultation on projects, which needs to be much broader, and so on and so forth. And then integration, again, I'll come back to that. Until we're approaching systems from an integrated perspective, where health professionals are involved with urban planners, are involved with transport planners, until we're thinking about the form of the city as a whole in a holistic way, we're not going to be able to address these kinds of questions of equity. So I think there have been really interesting positive things that have come out of equity concerns. The Bogota Ciclovia, which is the open streets movement, was originally the result of a movement for greater equity, greater accessibility to the streets. The right to the city is an important movement that promotes that kind of thing, and I think we need to engage with all of those. So I'll pass it on to Kristie.
I was not expecting it to get passed on to me. I think there are other tools available that can help cities think about the impacts before they actually happen. And so I think about the health impact assessments, the environmental impact assessments. Typically from the health impact, and I'm not an expert on health impact assessments by any means, but typically the health impact assessments that I've seen do have an equity element to it. So you want to make sure that you're not creating any health inequities as a result of let's say the transportation system that you're designing, the road that you're designing. And so I think if we could also get governments to consider the impacts prior to the implementation, then I think that would be very helpful as well. And so it could be tools like health impact assessments might be very, very useful. So I'll pass it on to Glynda.
Hi, yes. I think one of the things that came up in the earlier conversation is trying to bring people in close proximity to the services that they require or to places where they work, bringing a place where they live closer to where they work. However, if we really look at the reality, what we're seeing is that many of the cities actually do not, or it's very difficult for an ordinary employee to be living, let's say, in the central business district, because the rental rates and the cost of living and cost of any residential property would be quite high. And I think examples of policies that actually really encourage inclusive urban development and less gentrification, where we, because of the improvements in a city area, we actually are pushing away those who are unable to bear the cost of living within a certain area. I think those are the kinds of KPIs we also need to be looking at, this relationship between the bringing people really closer to where they work. I think is an important indicator, because then that would allow people to just walk or cycle, and not have to travel really long distances. There's the other movements that I'm seeing is also having equity in the use of road space. So in the Philippines, we have the Share the Road movement, which is implemented, where there's pedestrian space, there's also bicycle lanes, and so that I'm very hopeful that that will continue. I guess equity in infrastructure investments. You know, we all know how a lot of money is being spent for flyovers, for example, instead of safe bicycle lanes, safer pedestrian facilities. And this is in places where 70 to 80 don't own private cars. And so is it equitable to allocate most road space to private cars while leaving no space for cycling and pedestrian facilities? So these are questions I think that we have to be asking.
I think that's great. And oh yes, Jose, please go ahead, and then we'll go.
That just called to mind. I very much agree with everything Glynda said, and also with what Kristie said about health impact assessment and the importance of that, and also of a longer horizon, a longer view of impacts. But another thing I wanted to bring up was just the difference between interventions that sort of change variables, things that change specific things in a city. You know, for example, more cycleways or more green space. And things that change the structure of systems and the way they work. And I'm thinking of things like in Wales, there's something called the if I remember correctly, the Well-Being of Future Generations Act. And what it does is it requires that every public entity assess the well-being impacts of everything that it does. And so that is something that changes the way the system works. And I think that those kinds of interventions are likely to be more powerful and more self-correcting than sort of individual action. So we need to think about both of those things.
Yeah, I think that's a very lovely reference point to finish on, is reminding us to think about the well-being of the future. We have about 15 minutes left, and I understand we have some questions already that Chris has been collecting, but I'd like to invite people to share them in the chat box as well, or to share any other comments, observations, connections to resources that you may have there. But Chris, did you want to bring some questions to our speakers now then?
Yes, thank you so much, Bronwen, and thank you everybody for the really great conversation. I've really enjoyed listening to this. So we got a few questions from some of our participants related to messaging. So in the context of COVID and related to everything that you've already said, some of the participants are curious to hear from you how the state, how the government can kind of message better in the COVID context the benefits of using public transport, the benefits of changing modes of transport and mobility, to biking, to walking, to cycling, whatever it is, and how we can kind of ensure that people feel safe in accessing metros, buses, jeepneys, informal transport, which is a big element of this recovery, right? How do we protect informal transport systems that are so important for people in developing countries especially? So I don't know if maybe some of you want to take a quick tack on that to see how we can take that question forward.
Thanks. Let's go to Kristie then.
I'll tackle it first. So I think there's a couple messaging, and so I look at it more from not necessarily the government messaging, but what our local partners could say to governments to convince them to build back better. And so one of the one of the issues that's emerged as a result of COVID is that you are more likely to suffer adverse consequences if you catch COVID if you have a pre-existing condition. Obesity is one of those conditions, which then hypertension, anything to do with non-communicable diseases like heart disease, cancer, diabetes, stroke. So if you have any of those pre-existing conditions, you're not more likely to catch COVID, but you are more likely to experience adverse impacts as a result of it. And so one of the messages that we're encouraging our partners to talk to governments about is, in order to deal with a potential second wave of a pandemic, or in order to deal with a future pandemic, or any type of disruption, whether it's a climate disruption or whether it's a natural disaster disruption, that the healthier your population is going into that disruption, the more resilient your population is going to be, and the easier it is going to be for you to weather that disruption. And so we really need to be focusing then on those things that keep people healthy moving forward. So we need people to be physically active. We need people to be eating healthy foods. I won't talk about smoking because there seems to be some variability related to that maybe smoking actually is a protective factor. So I won't talk about that. But mental health issues, if you have people as a socially connected city. So all of these things that then really lead themselves to focusing on how we move people about the city, such as walking and cycling, all of those things then lead to creating those protective factors. And so those would be some of the messages that we would be encouraging our partners to talk about. And I think Jose looks like he has something that he'd like to say.
I'm thinking through answers, but I think that, well, in terms of messaging from government, certainly there have been some governments that have been more effective at messaging than others. I think that effective messaging, and first of all, it relies on clarity and consistency, perception of being on top of things, which hasn't always been the case for all governments. Certainly, I think it's helpful to have health messaging separated from politics, which hasn't always been the case. I also think that to the extent the government is sending messages about actions that will protect you, they also have to follow through and put the measures in place that actually do protect you. In terms of messaging to government, I think that, I would echo Kristie that health is more influential right now than it ever has been. Health messaging will be more influential in terms of moving policy than it ever has been before, because everybody's thinking about health. And it's not just the pre-existing conditions in terms of pre-existing health conditions, but it's also the intersection of equity and vulnerable groups with COVID outcomes. So we know that minority groups often suffer much worse outcomes from COVID. We know that vulnerable groups in general suffer more. So building on the conjoined power of the broad movements we've seen for equity these days, but also the reaction to COVID, I think is one way to help build in that incentive to build back better. And it's rebuilding all of society. It's not just rebuilding the infrastructure and so on and so forth. So Glynda, I'll pass it to you.
I'll just take off from what Kristie started, which is, and related to air pollution as a cause of many of the vulnerabilities that could impact the person, worse if you get the COVID infection. So really now the objective is to ensure that air quality is clean, so as not to potentially increase the risk of people being worse off when they happen to be infected with COVID. So I think that's an important message. Because now people are looking at evidence-based policies, so I think now we should also strengthen our the basis for policies to reduce emissions from air pollution sources. I think that would resonate a lot with the people and also with policymakers. Back to you, Bronwen.
Oh, sorry, do you mind if I jump in?
Please do.
Sure, go ahead.
So one of the things that our partners typically do, so we all know that good public policy can really fall flat if you don't have the public on board. And so COVID, especially when it comes to air quality, there are some people who have, for the first time in their entire lives, actually experienced good air quality. And that's a really hard thing to pilot test, right? So we will often go into one of our communities. Our partners will work with the local community to pilot test something specific, a specific intervention perhaps in a public space, or closing down a street for the day. But the air is only going to be so much cleaner as a result of that one intervention. But in some of our northern cities in India, I mean, they're seeing the Himalayas for the first time. So this has been a massive opportunity to actually have the public experience what it's like for clean air. And so I think as part of the messaging, it's also messaging to the public, bringing the media on board, because if the media doesn't understand it, it isn't articulating it out to people. So we could really, and I know that's been talked about quite a bit in terms of media. Oh, the pictures of the Himalayas from the Indian city. But I think we can build on that to help bring the public on board to say this is what it could be like all the time. You know how you don't need your asthma medication anymore? Well, that's what it could be like all the time if we built back better or did things differently. So I think that's really important as well.
It's a sense of the possible, really, isn't it? That people can actually touch and feel what's possible. Coming back to you, Chris, is there more questions? I've got one in the chat box here, but back to you first. Yeah.
We have a quick comment that it could be something interesting to comment on from all of you as speakers. The comment says, transport and spatial development patterns go hand in hand. They need to proceed in parallel with both driving change and just transitions to a better future. This means there is an active role for transport to play, not just the passive do no harm principle. So that's one of the comments from one of our participants. Thank you very much. And then I know some of you see our speaker, one of our participants, Heather, asking a question here. It says, there is a direct correlation between stress and family life, but this is rarely correlated to the length of the commute, whether it's formal and informal jobs. And she's wondering if the panelists have any examples. So back to you, Bronwen.
Thanks, Chris. I think this commute correlation is quite interesting. I was going to go to Glynda because you've talked about the commute time quite a lot, and certainly Manila is a bit famous for it.
But, yes.
Glynda, please lead off on that, and then the others can come in.
Yes. Well, the commute, there have been several testimonies of people living within Metro Manila. So Metro Manila is comprised of more than 10 cities and municipalities, and getting into the central business districts usually take a lot of time. If people don't wish to go through 2 hours of traffic, they would need to wake up very early, start their day very early, say they should be out of the house by 5 to cut that the commute to let's say 45 minutes. And so really and you can see the photos. There was this one organization which asked everyone who commutes, who takes public transportation, to take photos of their experience. And you could see people sleeping in the bus, and very, very early in the morning, the sun hasn't come up yet. And of course, all of the pollution around you when you're riding a jeepney. So it does contribute a lot of stress. It does contribute a lot of stress from a person. And while I don't have the specific study that says whether it affects work performance, I guess it's just common sense that if the commute already takes a lot of energy out of you, then work performance would be affected as well. And I guess you're not you're prone to be very grumpy at the end of the day, and not have time. Maybe if you have young kids, you wouldn't be able to interact with them because they're asleep when you leave. and they're asleep when you get home. So
this is definitely something that anecdotally has been reported quite a lot, is that people are discovering the joy of being at home around family a bit more, and realizing that they can actually manage their jobs from a home base. This is more, sort of like office style work. And we've talked already about that digital marketing side of it. I think the other side of the commute, of course, is that many people who use active transport for their commute is their de-stress time to leave the office behind and come home with a freshness for the family life. Jose, did you have any comment around these relationships, particularly from your aspects around well-being and relationship commuting and stress?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have too much new to add. I certainly think that the comment was right on. And I think it's come up several times, and I think Glynda illustrated it very, very nicely. I mean, you can have the best transport system in the world, but if workers live 50 miles out from where they need to work, then that it won't solve the equity or the well-being issues. So transport and spatial planning certainly have to go hand in hand. And that, there are ideas out there. The idea of the 15-minute city, that you should be able to access all your needs of life within a 15-minute radius is the kind of thinking that we need to have to address those kinds of issues. But I think we shouldn't underestimate the scale of the transformation that requires, especially in megacities, especially many cities that are highly informal. In terms of the correlation between family life and stress from commuting, I'm not aware of specific studies, but I'd be really surprised if there aren't correlations, for example, between domestic violence and stress and other sorts of family issues. And as you say, Bronwen, the reverse is also true, where the commute is something pleasant and de-stressing, then that probably correlates with better outcomes on a wide range of things. Kristie, pass it to you.
Yeah, so I'm not sure that I'm certainly not going to remember the reference, and I'm not sure I'm remembering even the details of it quite correctly. But there was something that makes me think. I read a study that came out of Toronto that if your commute was under 30 minutes, then you found that to be a fairly relaxing experience. It allowed you to decompress between work and home, and you arrived at home sort of ready to play. But then if it was beyond that 30 minutes, then it became much more problematic. But I'm sorry, I'm not sure. I certainly can't pull out what reference that would be, but that makes sense, right? So however you may sort of journey home, and this goes back to the happiness and sort of, is transport, does it need to give happiness? I don't even think it needs to give happiness, but it shouldn't prevent you from being happy, right? So if your commute home is absolute misery, then you're going to arrive home miserable, and then that's going to then have an impact on your family life, your interaction with your children, your interaction with your spouse. So I think that absolutely makes sense. And I'm not familiar with any specific study, but I'm pretty sure there was one out of Toronto.
Great, thanks, Kristie. Chris, can I check in if there's any more questions before we move to wrap up?
No new questions, so I don't know if you want to take the wrap up now and maybe let everybody have a quick say before we close up. Yeah. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah. So I just quickly back to my panelists. I think we're letting transport off the hook on happiness as directly responsible, but certainly around elements of equity, access, enabling well-being, then transport definitely has a role to play in our systems, alongside land use planning, localized services, proximity to healthcare, and all the elements that we have discussed today. I'd like to go to each of you in turn for any final remarks or closing points that you would like to make. There's about a minute each if you want to take it, and we'll go first to you, Jose, if you like, please.
Okay, I would say that I don't want to take transport completely off the hook for happiness. I think that part of well-being is access to opportunities or things that make you happy, ability to have the access to that kind of opportunity. So there is a place in there for it. I just wanted to say that I really appreciate having been invited. And I think that this kind of discussion, this chat among people from different groups and different sectors, is exactly the kind of thing that we need to better understand the different perspectives, to come up with creative, innovative ideas, and to really take advantage of the opportunities we have to advance well-being through transport, through other systems. So thank you for the opportunity, and I look forward to keeping in touch.
Yeah, thank you for joining us, Jose. Actually, I mean, it's what the SLOCAT partnership does, is aims to bring these diverse partners who ultimately have a shared ambition and an agenda, and bring those elements together. So it's been great that you have joined us today. Kristie, did you want to make any final remarks?
I was going to say exactly the same thing Jose did. I don't think that we should let transportation off the hook for happiness. It's just, I don't think they can deliver happiness, but they shouldn't make us unhappy either. And so there is a dichotomy of happiness and unhappiness. And so I think there is a role to play with that. And I think also as well, sort of, as I reflect on the conversation, it was really great to be able to think about happiness and to get my head out of my utilitarian peace, order, and good government, and think more like an American for a change. But I do think it's really important that whether we're talking about COVID or whether we're talking just about day-to-day life, that we are all in the same storm, but we're not in the same boat. And so as the transportation system begins to think about how are we going to emerge from this and build back better, remembering that not everyone is in the same boat, and that we really need to make sure that we're protecting those people that are in the canoe or the dinghy, and maybe not worry quite as much about the people who are in the yacht. So.
Great. It's a lovely transport/leisure analogy all at the same time there, Kristie. Fantastic. SLOCAT unfortunately does limit itself to land transport, and so these boat analogies carry us forward without upsetting our stakeholder base. Glynda, can any closing remarks from you?
Yes, I think transport is not off the hook, because in many cases we need transportation to access all of the services, that make life, getting basic needs, but also allowing us to appreciate nature, appreciate beauty and art, and fulfilling Maslow's hierarchy of needs, bringing us up higher in the pyramid to self-actualization. And I think we have a very good opportunity now, because a large number of people appreciate and now know what clean air means, and we should really take this opportunity to push for policies and changes in systems, in ways of thinking about how we can make people happier in the new normal.
Great. Thank you, Glynda. I see that Heather said in the comments that transport is the hook. And I think that's perhaps quite a nice way to look at it. When you remember the mortgage crisis in America a few years ago, and it was the vast suburbs with no alternative transport that really suffered. And I know it's those heavily suburbanized communities without proximity to food that have really suffered in the crisis as well, in terms of having ease of access through walking and cycling. I'm going to bring it to a close. I think it is a continuing challenge for us to not only keep transport on the hook, but make it the hook that can allow us to ensure a quality of life for all of the people in our communities, whether they be on yachts or in little tinny rowboats. So I want to pass back to Chris to close the session, but my personal thanks to our panelists. As chair of SLOCAT, I think it's a fantastic partnership, and it's together the partnership that we've had here for this discussion. More often.
Thank you, Bronwen. Thank you, Jose. Thank you, Glynda. Thank you, Kristie, for your participation. This has been really great. I'm really happy that we can have these informal fireside chats and to really bring new ideas into these conversations on sustainable low carbon transport and mobility. So thank you so much. In the chat box, I just put in our link to the homepage of the Tough Questions, Smart Answers, Activities and Tools series. So in there, you can find Bronwen's inaugural blog of our Morning Commute blog series, you can find recordings of our previous Fireside Chat, and there you'll find the recording for this Fireside Chat very soon. So we appreciate everybody's participation. Please do share all of these activities and tools with your networks, with your colleagues, and help us really spread the word, because we do want to start making sure that more and more constituencies, more and more sectors are engaging in conversations around sustainable low carbon transport and mobility. And we're so happy to have Jose, who's not a member, Wellcome Trust is not a member of our partnership, but we're super eager to make sure that new people, new faces, new organizations are really joining in on these really important conversations on transport and mobility. So a very special thank you to Bronwen for helping us moderate this, and an extra special thank you to our participants for joining us today. So thank you very much, everybody, and have a wonderful day, a wonderful evening, a wonderful weekend, wherever you are in the world, and see you all soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.